Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people like your worth was something only you could see? Grace Whitmore wasn't flashy. She wore secondhand shoes, poured coffee into a dented thermos, and blended into the background of boardrooms where she worked harder than anyone else. No one really noticed her, except an old war veteran next door and a quiet millionaire who was watching more than he let on. Then one invitation changed everything. She was asked to attend a gala, filled with polished smiles, whispered judgments, and people who didn't expect much from someone who looked like that. But Grace had something they couldn't see: kindness, grit, and a story that would soon silence the entire room. What would you do if offered a seat among the very people who overlooked you? Would you go? Would you stay silent, or finally let them see who you really are? This is not just a story about a woman at a gala. It's a story about every quiet person who ever lit up a room, not with appearance, but with grace. If your heart has ever been underestimated, come closer. This story is for you. Grace adjusted the collar of her thrifted coat, stepping into the morning fog of Tacoma coffee thermos, in hand and dreams folded deep in her pocket. The air smelled like wet bark and roasted beans from the corner roastery. She walked slowly, deliberately, her boots brushing through a blanket of maple leaves. Across the narrow street, Frank Delaney sat on his porch swing, a folded Tacoma Tribune in one hand and a pair of smudged bifocals perched low on his nose. Some folks got light, he muttered, not quite looking up. They don't even know it. Grace smiled, tipping her thermos toward him in greeting. Good morning, Frank. He raised his newspaper in salute. Mornin', Grace. Got your whole world in that mug. Don't you? Just the caffeine part, she chuckled, taking a slow sip. The coffee had cooled slightly, too bitter, but familiar. She held it close anyway. A pair of hummingbirds darted around the feeder, hanging near Frank's porch. The beads of condensation on his window glistened like tiny chandeliers, catching the soft, gray light of an overcast November morning. Need help with the groceries? She asked, noticing the brown paper bags stacked unevenly near his feet. Wouldn't say no to strong arms and a kind soul. Together, they carried the bags inside. His home smelled of cedar and distant jazz, dusty but alive. Grace noticed the record player resting on an old sewing table in the corner, surrounded by vinyl jackets curled at the edges. You still listen to those? She asked, nodding toward the player. Some nights, Frank replied. The quiet needs melody sometimes. Back outside, Grace walked briskly to her bus stop. A faded signpost leaned just enough to cast a crooked shadow across the sidewalk. She caught the 7:45 to downtown, where a tall glass building housed the public relations firm she worked at on the 6th floor, next to the printer that never quite worked. Inside the office, the mood was caffeinated and clipped. Grace settled into her cubicle, coat draped over the back of her chair. Her computer blinked patiently. Ethan Sterling, head of corporate partnerships, stood near the conference table. Sleeves rolled and voice calm. His confidence wasn't loud. It was practiced, measured. He acknowledged everyone, but when his eyes landed on Grace, he paused. Before we dive in, he said, tapping the tablet in his hand, just a quick nod to Grace for catching that client, quote, correction before it went out. Saved us some face. Nice catch. A few heads turned her way. Grace smiled gently and whispered, Thanks, barely audible over the tapping keyboards. Cliff Reynolds leaned back in his chair, adjusting the cuffs of his pressed shirt. That's Grace for you, he said with a sideways smirk. Always behind the curtain, quiet, modest, like wallpaper, reliable wallpaper. The room chuckled, politely enough to pretend it wasn't cruel. Grace looked down at her hands. The coffee stain on her sleeve had dried. She said nothing. At lunch, she escaped to Sunrise Cafe, the corner diner 2 blocks away. Frank's favorite. She slid into a booth by the window, where he always claimed the seat with the view. The waitress, Loretta, poured her a refill without asking. Your neighbor was in here earlier, she said, used his senior discount and left a $5 tip. Said it was for the sunshine and the fog. Whatever that means. Grace smiled, stirring her coffee with a chipped spoon. She stared out the window, watching the city breathe. That evening, back on her porch, Frank appeared beside her with something wrapped in flannel. Got something for you, he said. It's not new, but it's true. He unwrapped an old vinyl record. Thelonious Monk, straight, no chaser, music finds those who listen, he said, holding it out like a secret, not those who speak loud. Grace took it like it might crumble in her hands. I don't have a record player. You got ears and a neighbor who does, he replied. Later that night, as she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and stared at the porch light across the street, her phone buzzed. Ethan's name appeared. Hey, Grace, this might be out of the blue, but would you be interested in joining me at the Thanksgiving Gala next weekend dress formal? Think about it. She stared at the screen for a long moment. She hesitated. Grace glanced at Clara, then at her own gloved hands, resting in her lap. The satin was slightly wrinkled, second-hand, but clean. She tucked her mother's vintage clutch under one arm and nodded faintly. As they drove through the city, the skyline of Tacoma glimmered through a veil of light mist. The harbor reflected streaks of gold from the early evening lights, while jazz from the car's radio hummed, low smooth and melancholic, like it was narrating a secret. So, Clara said gently. First time at the gala, Grace nodded. First time anywhere like it. Honestly. Clara smiled. Don't let the sparkle fool you. Most people here are playing dress-up, one way or another. They passed Sunrise Cafe, its neon sign flickering a bit too fast for comfort. Grace imagined Frank in his favorite booth, tipping his hat to the waitress, maybe leaving another poetic tip, like, for the sunshine behind the clouds. At the next light, Clara turned to her. You know, when Ethan asked me to help you prepare, I was surprised, not because of you, she added quickly, but because he rarely asks. Grace considered that. He didn't have to. No, he didn't, Clara said, voice low. That's the point. They arrived at the venue, a tall, glass-encased structure that gleamed under twinkling string lights and lanterns hanging from oak branches. Inside, a jazz quartet played soft standards while trays of hors d'oeuvres floated by like elegant fish in a pond. Clara led Grace through the grand doors and into the ballroom, where polished shoes tapped against marble and laughter sparkled louder than the champagne. For a moment, Grace stood still. Every detail in the room, the chandeliers, the embroidered napkins, the metallic thread in the chair sashes, seemed to whisper, not yours. Her breath caught in her throat, but she held herself tall, her posture shaped by her mother's voice and Frank's quiet truths. Across the room, Cliff caught sight of her. His eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. Then he smirked, leaned toward a man in a silver tie, and whispered something. They both glanced back. Grace looked away before their eyes met hers. She made her way to the side of the room, past a table of executives, past a tray of lobster canapes. A waiter offered her a flute of sparkling cider. She took it with a soft thank you, her fingers steady despite the tremble in her chest. Grace. The sound of her name and Ethan's voice felt like an anchor. He stood near the balcony entrance, dressed in a charcoal suit, the top button of his shirt casually undone. The look in his eyes held no surprise, just a kind of recognition, like seeing something that had been there all along. "I didn't recognize you," he said. "You look—" "Like someone from a garage sale," she offered, a soft half smile. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Like someone I'm glad is here?" They stepped onto the balcony together. The air was cool but not biting, and the city stretched before them in quiet elegance. "I heard what Cliff said, in your office," she said softly, not looking at him. "I didn't then, but I do now." Ethan leaned on the railing. "He's noise. Your signal." Grace looked up at him. "Why me? Why bring someone who doesn't fit because you do?" he said, "in all the ways that matter." Inside. A toast began. The room applauded politely, the clinking of glasses rising like wind chimes. "Do you ever feel like you're borrowing the moment?" she asked. "All the time," Ethan replied. "But then I remind myself some of us were just raised to be quiet about what we deserve." Back inside, Clara found them again. "Photo booths open," she said brightly. "Before the crowd floods it." Grace hesitated. "I've never liked being in front of the camera." "Well," Clara said, looping her arm through Grace's, "tonight's not about what you've liked. It's about what you've earned." They posed together in front of a faux golden arch, and the photographer snapped 3 pictures in quick succession. In the third, Grace laughed, genuine, unguarded. Later, while waiting for the valet, Grace overheard a pair of young guests chatting nearby. "I think she's with the catering staff." One whispered, "Or maybe a charity placement, Nobun." The other said, lowering her voice, "She came with Mr. Sloane." The first girl raised her brows. "Really, huh?" Clara turned to Grace, unbothered. "People always need categories. They feel safer with labels." Grace exhaled slowly. "I'd rather be remembered than categorized." Clara smiled. "That's why you will be—" She squeezed Grace's hand and motioned toward the arriving sedan. "You'll be remembered." A faded photograph of Grace's mother at her own first gala sits beside a candle as she helps Grace hem her gown. Rain tapped against the roof like a soft drum roll, the house glowing with golden kitchen light against the pale night. The mercury stuck around 46 Deguro outside. Grace leaned over the old oak table, needles sliding through emerald fabric, as her mother, Rachel, looked on. An old radio in the corner whispered Nat King Cole's voice, unforgettable, and the melody wrapped the room in gentle warmth. "People forget," Rachel said, quietly, her fingers steady with experience. "Real grace doesn't beg attention." She paused, studying the photograph, a young woman in a chiffon gown, gloves neatly fitted, the edges of the picture curled from time. Grace didn't look away. "You looked happy." She tucked the needle back into the pincushion and straightened the seam. Nancy, her younger sister, perched on a stool by the sewing machine, twisted a strand of her blonde hair around a finger. "Happy and nervous," Rachel recalled. "That was the church fundraiser. I borrowed gloves from the pastor's wife. Thought they'd dress me up, but halfway through, someone whispered I was trying too hard. But then I gave a speech and got applause." Rachel smiled at the memory. They forgot the gloves. They remembered the words. Grace's brow softened. "That's what I want tonight, Nancy rolled her eyes in an older sister way. What you want is to stop calling it tonight. It's your night. Own it. Grace let out a quiet laugh. Baby steps. She lifted the brooch Rachel held out, a silver filigree piece with a single pearl. Rachel had kept it safe after all these years. Mother's touch, Grace said, fastening it at the neckline. The pearl caught candlelight and shimmered. The dress fell smoothly now, hem even, seams flat. Rachel stepped back, hands on hips. Now walk like you're made of more than fabric. Grace slid off the stool and stood tall. Her nail polish was chipped soft pink with faded tips, but Nancy pressed her hand and produced a small bottle of matching polish. 2 seconds, she said, applying a steady coat. She paused at Grace's gaze. Perfect, she whispered. Outside, a car door clicked. Grace swept her hand over the dress one last time. Rain had stopped, and the drizzle had left the driveway glistening. She pulled on simple black heels, her mother's from 3 decades ago, and took a steady breath. Nancy grabbed Grace's arm. Come on. Glamour waits. Grace stepped into the hallway, smooth skirt swishing over the hardwood. Frank's silhouette appeared in the window across the street, framed by pale porch light. He watched quietly, head tilted slightly. She'll change more than this night, he murmured. Voice soft enough only the wind could carry. Nancy followed Grace outside and murmured, It suits you. Grace nodded, glancing once more into the night. Inside, the radio faded softly to instrumental, Nat King Cole drifting away like a promise. She lifted her chin, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the waiting car. Its headlights reflected off the rain-slick pavement, ever so often, in puddles. She caught a glimpse of the brooch, sparkling. A small weight of confidence settled in her chest. The car door closed behind her. Silence fell, but inside Grace's mind, her mother's words echoed. Real Grace doesn't beg attention. Frank's eyes followed her departure. The glow from his porch lantern landed upon his face, the kind of quiet pride reserved for unseen moments. His fingers brushed against the window. She's ready, he whispered. Grace stepped into the ballroom, heart pounding louder than the jazz band's trumpet. For a moment, she didn't move. The polished marble beneath her feet gleamed like still water, reflecting the soft shimmer of chandeliers above. The Fairview Ballroom, grand and familiar, only to those who belonged, radiated warmth in its holiday elegance. A golden glow floated across white table linens, while a soft melody from the string quartet drifted between conversations like a breeze through autumn leaves. She took a breath, steadying her steps, and entered. Her heels tapped gently as she walked further into the sea of navy suits, silk dresses, and champagne flutes. Conversations ebbed and swelled, glasses clinked in quiet rhythm, the scent of roasted chestnuts, citrus-spiced candles, and cinnamon cider floated in the air, mingling with subtle hints of perfume and old wood. Eyes turned toward her, not all at once, but in waves. Some glanced and nodded politely, others lingered just a heartbeat longer, their expressions hovering between curiosity and mild surprise. A few mostly younger guests with designer labels stitched into their collars let their eyes drift away before fully registering her. Cliff stood near the bar, half turned toward her. His fingers curled casually around an espresso glass filled with dark bourbon. The light glinted off his cufflink as he lifted the glass slowly to his lips. When he saw her, his brows lifted slightly, not dramatically, but just enough. Then, the smirk appeared. Subtle, smug, well-rehearsed. He hasn't changed. She exhaled slowly and looked away, refusing to let her steps falter. Near the refreshment table, Clara stood in a sleek forest green dress that shimmered slightly under the lights. She greeted Grace with a warm touch to the elbow. "You made it," Clara said, then smiled as if proud of a choice well made. "That dress. Lovely work." "My mom and sister hemmed it," Grace replied, smoothing the fabric unconsciously. "It's older than I am." "Even better," Clara said with a wink. "Character never goes out of style." Grace moved toward the drink station. Champagne sparkled in tall flutes beside spiced cider, served in small glass mugs rimmed with cinnamon. She picked one up, the heat seeping into her palms, grounding her. The scent of apples and cloves reminded her of home, the scent of Thanksgivings past, of simmering pots and her mother's hands moving methodically in the kitchen. She took a slow sip and turned toward the main hall, where a crowd had gathered near the string quartet. Ethan stood in conversation with two older men and a woman in a cranberry-colored shawl. He caught her eye mid-sentence and offered a subtle nod. He looked composed, as always, tailored suit, no tie, and that still, thoughtful presence he carried like a signature. Soon, he made his way toward her. "You clean up well," he said, his tone light. "Not bad for a girl with borrowed heels," Grace replied, and a flicker of a smile touched her lips. He studied her a moment. "There's a quiet confidence about you tonight." "I'm trying not to trip over the carpet," she said. He laughed softly, then glanced over his shoulder as someone called his name. "You'll be fine." She nodded, watching him walk away, disappearing into the current of evening wear and candlelight. Grace wandered past a tall window and paused, looking out. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 39 degrees off him. Frost clung to car rooftops and edges of lampposts. She wrapped both hands around the mug of cider, absorbing its warmth. A few guests offered small talk. One elderly woman in a faux fur wrap asked if Grace worked for the event staff. Grace smiled and answered politely, though she noted the woman's subtle embarrassment. Once she realized her mistake, no offense was meant, just assumption, well practiced and quiet like so many others. It wasn't long before Clara took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara's voice rang out, poised and warm. "Thank you for gathering tonight, not just to celebrate, but to remember what this season means: giving, resilience, and community." Guests settled into their chairs. Waiters moved in a practiced rhythm, refilling cider mugs and replacing empty dessert trays with small plates of pumpkin pies glistening under caramel glaze. Grace selected one and returned to her seat near the center left of the room. Clara continued, "Tonight, a few voices from our own community will share moments that reflect what it means to keep showing up even when unnoticed." 3 speakers followed: a teacher, a local grocer, a retired nurse. Each told small stories of compassion, of losses and rebuildings, of choosing kindness when bitterness seemed easier. Then Clara called her name. Grace stood. Her pulse drummed in her ears, but her face stayed calm. The hem of her dress brushed softly against her ankles. As she stepped onto the platform, the room held its breath. "I wasn't sure what to share," she began, voice firm but soft, "until I thought of my mother." A few heads tilted. "She's the reason I show up to anything. The kind of woman who repairs what breaks, even if she's not the one who broke it." She went on to describe the winter storm that tore their porch apart 3 years ago. How Rachel had rebuilt it herself over 2 weekends with a borrowed drill, mismatched nails, and no formal training. How neighbors walked by, watching her work silently, unsure if they should offer help or stay out of the way. But she just kept showing up. Grace said, "No applause, no praise, just action." As she spoke, the room began to shift, not in noise, but in posture. People leaned forward. One man rested his elbow on the table and tapped his fingers. Slowly. A woman near the back lowered her glass, eyes fixed on Grace. "She taught me that doing the right thing rarely gets noticed right away," Grace continued, "but it lasts longer than the things that shout for attention." A beat of silence followed her last words, then quiet nods, a slow exhale from somewhere near the front. The music didn't resume immediately. There was space for what had just been said. Grace stepped off the platform, unsure what to do with her hands. Ethan met her partway. "That story," he said softly. "You just outshined the CEO table." She blinked. "You're joking." "Not at all." The guy next to me stopped mid-bite. She smiled. And this time, it reached her eyes. A waiter passed by, and Grace took another mug of cider. She wasn't hungry anymore, but the warmth kept her centered. Someone tapped her arm. It was Clara. "Let's walk," she said, guiding Grace gently toward the side hall. They moved past guests, laughing over dessert, past twinkling lights wound around staircase banisters. At the quieter end of the corridor, Clara turned to her, expression thoughtful. "Let's talk. Monday. I have a proposition." A bouquet of peonies waited on Grace's desk, a card that simply read, "For every moment you made dignified." The petals seemed to glow in the late morning light filtering through her office window. Outside, the temperature read 44 degrees, and frost still hugged the edges of the window panes. Grace ran her fingers over the soft pink blooms, breathing in their gentle, powdery scent. Thanksgiving was behind her, and yet the warmth of the season lingered like a comfortable embrace. She settled into her swivel chair, unused to this seat of acknowledgement. The bouquet and card were unexpected, a gesture that felt both personal and public. She traced the words again. "Every moment you made dignified." What moments had changed someone's heart? Her thoughts drifted to Clara's words from Saturday. "Let's talk Monday." The phrase replayed itself in her mind like a refrain she hadn't fully heard yet. Then there was Ethan, supportive, steady, but distant enough to guard something deeper. Today might bring answers. A soft knock came at the door. Ethan entered without waiting for a response, closing the door behind him. He carried a small leather-bound notebook and wore a thoughtful look, as though this meeting held more weight than casual office talk. "Morning," he began, voice low and steady. "I wanted to follow up after the gala. Can I sit?" "Please," Grace said, gesturing to the chair across from her. She paused, realizing silence was a statement in itself. He sat, placing the notebook on her desk. It rattled softly against the wood. "I spoke with Clara. He said, she told me you stood out. She asked if you'd be interested in co-leading the holiday benefit." Grace's pulse quickened. The holiday benefit was the biggest event of the year. Board-level oversight, donor engagement, program design. Her throat went dry. I don't know," she whispered. "I've never done anything like that. I don't even know where to start." Ethan leaned forward. "You already started, you just didn't realize. You brought honesty, dignity, and real story. That's exactly what this benefit needs." Grace swallowed, her eyes drifting to the frosted window. Her breath steamed slightly on the glass. He paused, then reached into his jacket pocket and produced a slender box. He opened it carefully, revealing a silver pen engraved William S. Sterling. He watched her until she met his eyes. "This belonged to my father. He used it to sign the Foundation's first charter. He believed that every meaningful beginning deserves a steady hand. Grace stared at the pen. Its weight felt meaningful, tangible, a promise and a responsibility all at once. She ran a fingertip over the engraving. Why me? He folded his hands. Because you lead with grace, because you don't speak to be heard, you speak so others will hear. Because when you told your story at the gala, it wasn't polished, it was real. Grace felt an ache in her chest. So many times she'd hidden behind neat seams and polite words. Now she saw those qualities differently, less as shields, more as strengths. He leaned back. I want you to have this pen. If you accept Clara's offer, I'd like you to use it. Grace pressed her lips together, feeling a swell of emotion. She nodded slowly. A click at the door announced Cliff. He walked in, hands in his coat pockets, sealing it at the neck against the cold. Morning, Cliff said, eyebrows raised as he spotted the bouquet and pen box. Grace looked up. Morning. Cliff. He offered a brief half smile. Heard you might be steering the event, he said quietly. Well, congratulations. Grace blinked, surprised. Thank you. Cliff nodded. It takes guts to stand out at a board meeting and the gala. You've certainly earned your place. He turned and left, and the door clicked shut behind him. Grace exhaled, her shoulders sinking as relief washed over her. She turned to Ethan. You heard that she asked softly. He said, I earned it. Ethan stood and crossed to the window. He stared out at the winter gray sky. He earned it too, he said quietly. Someone saved him when he was younger, gave him a chance he didn't think he deserved. Grace turned her head. I didn't know. He smiled softly, then looked back at her. He never talked about it much, but he carried it quietly, like you carry your own dignity. Her mind raced. If Frank had saved Ethan, her boss, her mentor, the circle of kindness, was deeper than she'd realized. She reached for the pen box again, gripping it like a lifeline. The bouquet seemed to glow warmer, more hopeful. Ethan turned back. Use the pen. Grace, write the story you want to tell, for the foundation, for our community, for yourself. Her voice came softly, but with unexpected strength. Thank you. I will. The two stood together in silence for a moment. The hum of the office around them softened by possibility. Outside, the frost shifted, ready to thaw. If only someone gave it time. Ethan watched her and said quietly, and I think he deserves a seat at that gala. The diner smelled like burnt toast, and Hope Grace stirred her coffee. Unaware she was about to hear a story that would change everything, she sat in Frank's usual booth at Sunrise Cafe, early morning light filtering through condensation-beaded windows. The air was cool, about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the comfort of the diner mingled with the soft strains of Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade playing over the speakers. Grace wrapped her hands around a steaming mug and watched the wavy reflections in the glass. She'd invited him for breakfast, wanting to thank him personally for everything he'd done, starting with that record, the vinyl, and the quiet encouragement that followed. Frank arrived with his usual slow steps, a gentle wave of recognition, and a weathered leather coat hanging on the back of the chair opposite her. Morning, Grace, he said, settling in. You sure you want pancakes or something more sensible? Whatever you're having, she replied, offering a half smile. You pick? He nodded, catching the waitress's eye. Soon 2 steaming plates appeared, eggs sunny side, home fries, and golden toast, alongside mugs of coffee, strong and black. Grace took a sip, delighted by the sharp taste that cut through the morning air. Frank listened for a moment before speaking, eyes soft. "You've been doing some remarkable things lately, Grace. I've watched you." She gently reached for a fork. "That's my job. Thanks for being there, though." He nodded, gaze drifting out the window. The glass misted further as a breeze drifted by outside. "There's something I never told you." Grace paused, fork in hand. "I'm listening." Frank cleared his throat and leaned back. "About 25 years ago, before I moved here, I was living in Milwaukee. It was January, bitter cold, snow everywhere, roads slick, and the storm came fast. I was leaving the VA hospital, where I was doing some volunteer work, intended to be a short drive home." He paused, reflecting on memory. Grace set down her fork and leaned forward. It started snowing so heavy, the road disappeared under white. I rounded a bend and saw a child at the side. He'd slid off the road, inside a ditch full of ice water. I pulled over, ran down, cut the engine, and slid into the freezing mess. Grace gasped softly, picturing it. It was so cold, I could hardly feel my hands. I grabbed him. He wasn't moving much, but I got him out, wrapped him in a jacket from my trunk, and drove him to the ER. Frank shook his head. Luckily, that hospital was close. "Did he?" Grace asked quietly. Frank smiled. "He made it. Took a long while, but the boy pulled through. His mom found out eventually. Sent me a letter, never knew who I was, just called me her angel." He sighed, smiling at the memory. Never thought much about it after. Grace sat, tears brimming in her eyes, warmed by the story. At that moment, Ethan slipped through the door, late but calm. He offered Grace a gentle nod, then turned his gaze to Frank, who was looking down at his coffee. Grace glanced at Ethan as he slid into the booth beside Frank, careful not to interrupt. Frank looked up, startled. Ethan took a slow breath, voice thick. I think I owe you my life." Frank froze, fork halfway to his mouth. "I'm the boy." Grace's hand went to her mouth. A silence filled the space between them. Frank pushed back, disbelieving. "Ethan?" Ethan nodded, voice catching. "That winter night, you were someplace safe for me." Grace watched as shock, gratitude, and emotion rippled across Frank's face. His weathered hands trembled slightly, the fork clattering against the plate. Frank stood, voice thick. I remember the boy, but I never thought this." He gestured between them. "You grew up, you became, there's..." Ethan swallowed. "Your kindness gave me a future." Frank sank back into the booth. "That's more than enough." Grace reached across and squeezed Frank's hand. Warm, real. She had tears that didn't feel like weakness. Before she could speak, the waitress returned, smiling. She set down the bill and collected empty plates. Frank fumbled for cash, adding an extra $4 as a tip. He pushed it across the table. "Keep it $4 for good people doing quiet things." Grace frowned slightly, then nodded. Later. They stood at the door as Ethan prepared to leave. The autumn sunlight of late November shone weakly through fog. Outside, the street was nearly deserted. Grace stepped forward first. "That story. Thank you." Frank looked at Ethan. "I had no idea." Ethan replied, softly, "Neither did I until tonight." Frank placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You've made me proud." As they walked toward their cars, Ethan paused. "Mr. Delaney, if you're comfortable, I'd like to formally invite you to speak at the holiday gala." to tell that story. Frank's breath caught. Me? At the gala, Ethan nodded. Yes. Frank swallowed hard, eyes meeting Ethan's. I need time. Grace reached for Frank's arm. Of course. They paused in the cold morning air. Steam rose from their breaths. Glenn Miller's tune, distant, hummed through the diner doors. Ethan offered a soft smile. No rush. Frank nodded, overwhelmed. Grace watched him hesitating, understanding he sensed something larger than himself shifting that morning. Ethan's next words hung in the air as Grace watched Frank's struggle to find his voice. Ethan invited Frank to speak at the holiday gala. Frank hesitates, overwhelmed. Grace stared at the embossed letterhead on Clara's proposal. It felt heavier than paper should. Sunlight glimmered through a frosty window at the charity headquarters. It was December 1st, and the thermometer outside the office read a brisk 38 degrees. Inside, festive garlands wound around doorframes, and amber string lights cast a cozy glow over polished wood and the soft whir of a heater. Grace held the letterhead in her fingers, the weight of expectation nestled between the embossed logo and her name typed below. Clara stood nearby, adjusting a vintage brooch pinned to her lapel, delicate silver filigree that mirrored the one Rachel had given Grace. It caught Grace's eye, as if lighting a spark of recognition. This, Clara said gently, is your invitation to co-direct the holiday benefit, you and I, together. Grace inhaled slowly. Clara, I'm honored. I never expected this. Clara nodded, her posture both confident and entirely supportive. Because you don't announce yourself. Grace, you let your actions speak. That's leadership. Grace swallowed. She thought of her second-hand gown at the gala, of Ethan's unwavering support, of Frank's voice steadying hers, but self-doubt lingered like the chill outside. She shifted on the chair, eyes moving to Ethan, who stood just inside the door, observing quietly. His expression was still, nearly hidden, but his presence provided a steadying heartbeat in her chest. I have doubts, she admitted. Finally, I don't look like the people who usually lead these events. I don't have their polish. Clara leaned forward. That's exactly why you're needed. Grace bit her lip. Then she closed her eyes, thinking of Rachel's hesitant confidence, of Frank's lifetime of quiet action, of Ethan's gift of the pen. Ethan stepped forward then, voice calm, resonant. The best leaders never announce themselves, he said. They're revealed. Like the story you told at the gala took a few moments of silence. Then the room listened. That's leadership too. Grace opened her eyes. What if it's not enough? He gave a small smile. What if it is? Clara slipped a pristine folder across the desk. There's the agenda, the budget, names of sponsors who want someone genuine to lead this year. Not polished platitudes, but real purpose. Grace glanced down. She saw bolded headings, program, speakers, logistics, under lead speaker. A blank line awaited. She looked at Clara, then at Ethan, then back at the page. If I say yes, Grace finally said, voice soft but firm, I have one condition. Clara and Ethan both looked up. Grace drew a breath. Frank Delaney must speak at the event. His story of pulling someone from the snow, it needs to be told. A spark of hesitation flickered in Clara's eyes. Ethan nodded steadily. I understand, Clara said after a moment, gaze unwavering. I'll add him to the program. Grace exhaled, relief softening her shoulders. She scanned the document again and signed her name with an unsure flourish. Signing into possibility felt heavier than uncertainty. Congratulations, Clara said, voice warm. Grace squeezed Clara's hand, then reached into her purse and pulled out a yellow legal pad. She opened it and began writing. Longhand, a first draft of her speech pen gliding across page like measured footsteps toward purpose. Ethan watched her. Then he stepped to Grace's side and placed the silver pen, her pen beside the legal pad. She looked at it and back at him. He gave the faintest nod, encouragement glowing in his steady gaze. They stood there for a moment, the three of them surrounded by twinkling lights and the tang of frosty air just beyond the glass. At the door, Cliff passed by, pausing long enough to glimpse inside. He raised his eyebrows slightly when he saw Grace sitting at the desk, pen in hand, deep in concentration. Later. As Clara and Ethan left, Cliff remained outside. He raised his phone and typed quickly, stalling outside the warmly lit headquarters as the cold seeped into his coat. Cliff hears of Grace's promotion and quietly starts digging into her past. Grace stared at the embossed letterhead on Clara's proposal. It felt heavier than paper should. Twinkling garlands framed the room like a quiet promise. The gentle hum of heaters competed softly with the evening's festive soundtrack. Outside, December's chill settled in at 38 degrees, frost etched in lace on the window panes. Inside, warmth greeted her in every corner. Amber lights, the scent of pine, and that silent hum of possibilities. Clara sat beside her, the vintage brooch she wore glowing faintly, and across the desk, Ethan watched with calm encouragement. "This is your invitation to co-direct the holiday benefit." "Grace," Clara said, voice steady, "to shape the evening alongside me." The embossed logo shimmered beneath her fingertips like a secret waiting to be told. Her heart thudded with both gratitude and fear. Clara continued, "Your authenticity, your story's real dignity. That's what the board wants this year. Someone genuine, grounded." Grace exhaled slowly. I'm honored. I never expected this offer." "You lead by letting truth speak," Clara replied. "You model through presence, not proclamation." Ethan stepped forward, hands folded. The best leaders don't announce themselves with banners. They reveal their strength through action, often quietly. "That's who you are." She nodded, digesting every word, hands trembling. Grace glanced at the folder before her. It contained event budgets, a preliminary schedule, sponsorship details, and an empty spot under lead speaker. Clara touched the table gently. "Take a look." This is not symbolic. It's substantial. Co-director means leadership. Grace focused on the empty line. Her vision blurred slightly with emotion. She thought of Frank's kind guidance, her mother's gentle faith, and Ethan's resolute support. "If I accept," she said slowly, voice trembling at first, then one condition. Clara and Ethan leaned in. "I want Frank to speak." Her voice grew firmer. "His story belongs in the spotlight." A hush fell. Clara exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. Ethan nodded, resolute. Clara's chamber softened as she exhaled. "Absolutely. He'll be featured." With a shaky breath, Grace took the pen Clara slid across the desk and signed. Her signature felt larger than her name. As Clara and Ethan smiled, she pulled out a yellow legal pad and began drafting lines of her acceptance speech, pen weaving hope into words. Ethan lowered the silver pen, engraved with her name beside her, a symbol of trust. She pressed its weight into her palm, a tangible affirmation. They paused, in the doorway. Cliff lingered, brief pause, half smile, then slipped away. Grace didn't look up, but she sensed the undercurrent of curiosity. Clara and Ethan left softly, and the office fell into a glow of calm celebration. Grace wrote her first sentence, It is a privilege to stand with purpose. She paused, heart steady. Cliff hears of Grace's promotion and quietly starts digging into her past. The gala was full. The lights were warm. But it was Frank's voice that held the room still. Snow had begun to fall early that afternoon, casting a quiet hush over the town. Icicles hung from the edges of the community hall, and inside, strings of soft white bulbs and garlands of evergreen created a space that felt less like a venue and more like a living memory. Candles flickered gently on round tables, dressed in burgundy and gold. Children in scarves and tiny gloves sang carols outside the entrance, their voices light and sweet, just barely cutting through the wind. Grace stood backstage, her hands resting on a folded paper she hadn't yet looked at. Her breath moved slowly in and out, across the curtain. Laughter swelled and receded like the tide. Her mother had buttoned up her coat earlier that evening and kissed her cheek. "You know who you are," Rachel had whispered. "Don't let them forget it." She stepped into the light. The crowd hushed as she reached the microphone, every footstep echoing gently across polished wood floors. She paused, letting the warmth of the room hold her. Frank sat in the front row, hands folded on his lap, wearing the navy blue suit Ethan had gifted him just 2 days prior. His shoes were freshly polished, probably for the first time in years. Grace spoke, voice steady but quiet. "When we talk about building things in this town, foundations, futures, faith, we often picture grand gestures, big voices, bold faces. But tonight, I want to honor the quieter things, the ones we don't always see, the people who've been building bridges for decades, even when no one walked across them." She looked down for a moment, then continued, "I grew up in a house where love didn't shout. It hummed in the kitchen while dinner simmered. It showed up in mended buttons, reheated coffee, and stories told just once. My mother taught me that dignity isn't something you put on like a dress. It's something you live." A few heads nodded. Some guests glanced toward Rachel, seated near the back, hands clasped tightly. Grace's voice softened. "Tonight, I have the privilege of introducing someone who's taught me more by saying less. A man whose story deserves a room like this. A man who once saved a life and never asked who it belonged to. Please welcome Mr. Frank Delaney." There was a pause, the kind of silence that feels purposeful. Then applause, warm and stretching, not explosive, but long. Frank stood slowly, buttoned his coat out of habit, and walked to the front. He didn't carry notes. Frank adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat once, and let the quiet linger. "I never thought I'd stand in a room like this," he began, his voice textured with age, but clear. "And I surely never thought I'd speak after someone like Grace. But I guess life's funny that way." Laughter rippled gently through the crowd, comfortable, respectful. "I moved to Tacoma after the war," he continued, "because I wanted a quieter life. I worked jobs with my hands, didn't talk much. Folks didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer stories. But one winter must have been '98, a storm rolled in. One of those nights where the sky turns to stone and the wind knocks like it's angry." He paused, letting the room settle. "I was driving near the East Ridge and saw tire marks skidding off the road. I stopped, found a boy no older than 10 in a ditch, jacket too thin, lips near blue. I didn't know his name, just wrapped him in my coat. Radioed for help, never saw him again." Frank's gaze shifted toward Ethan, who sat quietly at a side table, eyes fixed on the man who had once pulled him from snow and silence. I didn't think about it again for years, Frank said softly. Didn't need thanks, but sometimes, when the nights got cold, I'd wonder if that boy made it. If someone out there had the chance to grow up because I just happened to be late to dinner. A quiet tear rolled down the cheek of a woman near the back. I didn't know until this year, he added, voice catching. Didn't know that the boy had become a man who built things, who noticed quiet people, who invited old veterans to breakfasts and gave them suits when they had none. He looked straight at Ethan. Thank you, son. Then he turned to the rest of the room. Grace said something earlier about dignity. I'd like to add, kindness isn't loud. It doesn't need permission, and it doesn't keep score. Frank let his hands rest gently on the podium. I helped a boy once. He grew up to build bridges I now walk across. The applause started slowly, 1, 2, then a full chorus. No one stood at first, but within seconds, the entire hall rose to their feet. The sound was deep, not frantic, a recognition more than celebration. Candles flickered, snow fell. A few people wiped their eyes with embroidered napkins. Grace, watching from the edge of the curtain, felt her heart swell in ways she couldn't name. And as the applause continued, Cliff slipped out the side door. He didn't say goodbye, didn't take a cider. He walked into the snow with his phone in his hand and a look on his face that said questions would come. Snow fell in gentle waves as Grace walked the same bridge Ethan once crossed as a child. The world had softened beneath the weight of Christmas Eve. Street lamps cast long shadows across snowbanks, and the river below whispered more than it flowed. Grace pulled her scarf tighter as she stepped onto the bridge, her boots crunching against the frozen path. This bridge had stood for decades, steel and rust, paint chipped by time, but it held. Like people, she thought. Quiet, aging, stronger than they looked. Frank stood at the center, his gloved hands holding a small lantern. He turned slowly, smiling as Grace approached. Thought you might come. I needed the quiet, she said. He nodded. Quiet's where the real things speak. A few feet away, Rachel and Nancy leaned against the railing, mugs of cocoa in hand. They weren't talking, just watching snow swirl beneath the golden glow of the bridge lights. Rachel wore the same wool coat she'd worn to Grace's school concerts, the same one she had on when they'd said goodbye to Grace's father. Grace knew the weight of its pockets tissues, mints, a spare button, and once a folded prayer. Ethan arrived just as the town's bell tower struck 6. He carried a small box wrapped in craft paper, tied with red twine. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside Grace, shoulder to shoulder, eyes on the water below. I found this in Frank's things, he said finally, handing her the box. Inside was a yellowed note, edges curled, a child's handwriting, crooked and earnest. Thank you for stopping. I was cold, but you were warm. I think I will be okay now. Below it, in a smaller script, love. Ethan. Grace blinked away the tears before they could fall. He kept it for 25 years, Ethan said. He never told anyone, not even me. He said it reminded him that a moment can matter. They stood in silence, the kind that felt shared rather than empty. Rachel walked over and pulled Grace into a hug. You led with heart, she whispered. That's your legacy now. Behind them. Frank carefully lit the lantern, shielding the flame from the breeze. He placed it gently on the railing, its soft glow reflecting on the icy bridge surface. This is for everyone who's ever gone unseen, he murmured. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. There's one more thing, he said. The foundation. I want you to help lead it. With me. Grace looked at him, then at the light, at her mother's eyes, at the bridge beneath her feet. She smiled. It wasn't big or showy. It was the kind that glowed from somewhere behind the ribs. That's the kindest yes I've ever said. No one clapped. No one needed to. From the nearby chapel, the notes of silent night floated across the water. The choir was small, mostly children, but their voices wrapped around the evening like a familiar quilt. Frank tipped his head slightly to the sky, his breath misting above him. Grace slipped her hand into Ethan's. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. Because sometimes, the most powerful endings come wrapped in nothing louder than a lantern's glow and a song sung in the distance. The snow kept falling, quiet and sure, just as kindness had all along. Grace didn't ask for recognition, but in the end, her steady heart lit more than one path. Sometimes, the smallest gestures, an old brooch, a handwritten note, a second-hand dress carried the greatest echoes. Like a lantern left on a windowsill, a single act of grace can outshine 1,000 assumptions. And if this story stirred something in you, perhaps it's time to notice the quiet light near you, or be it for someone else. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need it today, and subscribing to our channel at Shining Stories. Every story is a light, and your support helps it shine farther.